Hello everyone and welcome to a very nice game that features a most ingenious way of countering the London system. It's a game from the FTX Crypto Cup round 3, Levon Aronian versus Magnus Carlsen, and you guys will enjoy this one. I don't know if you remember, last year in January I made a video on how to beat the London system with a very easy to remember setup, and unless White really knows how to counter this, you should not have any problems tackling this. So if you have any problems playing against the London, do check it out. I will put this short tutorial in the description below. It will be the first thing you will see. But this is a completely different way of countering the London, and a much more exciting one, if I may add. So let's check it out. And for those of you, I have seen some of you saying in the comments that these are not their actual ratings, and you are correct. These are not their FIDE ratings. These are their chess24 ratings that they are using when they are playing online, or not chess24, the Meltwater Champion chess tour ratings that are also used in the FTX Crypto Cup. So that's why they are different from from their official FIDE ratings. Some are higher rated, some are lower rated, and I've seen some of you were surprised and confused in the comments. So let's dive straight into it. Levon has the white pieces and he opens with d4. Magnus replies with pawn to e6. He goes for the Horvitz defense. We have knight to f3, knight to f6, and now bishop to f4. The London system is on the board, and Magnus replies with bishop to e7. We have h3 by Levon, and now comes pawn to b5. Now, there are some games that were played online, or rather, there is one game where this was played, but it was an online game. But for all intents and purposes, considering games over the board, we can consider this a completely new game. So already as of move 4, Magnus now has plans of playing a6 and then countering in the center with c5. And since e3 still wasn't played, Levon chose to play h3. Now you can choose this b5 idea. We have e3 now, preparing to capture on b5. Magnus defends it. Knight b to d2, and now bishop to b7, developing the bishop to this long diagonal. Bishop to d3 by Levon, preparing the standard setup with c3, d4, e3. The knight's here, and the bishop's placed like this. So this is pretty much playable against every defense black chooses, except the one that I have made in the description below. So here, pawn to c5. Magnus strikes against the center, c3, and now knight to c6. We have pawn to e4. Levon now improves his position in the center, grabs more space. We have d6 by Magnus, and now bishop back to e3. Castles by both Levon and Magnus, and now rook to c8 by Magnus, developing the rook. D captures on c5. We have d captures now attacking the rook. If Levon wanted to capture on c5, maybe it would have been better to capture a bit sooner. Now this recapture comes with tempo. So queen to e2, defending the bishop, and now, of course, queen to c7, preparing to bring this rook to d8. And then Magnus will have completed his development. So here, pawn to a4, attacking this beautiful expansion Magnus created on the queen side, and now pawn to c4. Magnus waited quite some time for this c4 move, but now is the time to play it. c4, bishop to c2, and now rook f to d8. We have rook f to d1, and now pawn to h6, creating some breathing room for the king on h7, and also taking away the g5 square from Levon's pieces, as if Levon can sacrifice a pawn, open up the light square bishop, could be very nasty, as we've seen how fiercely Levon can attack. But now it's time to attack this expansion Magnus has on the queen side. So captures, and pawn to b3. This is how it's usually done, but you guys probably already know what Magnus played here. C captures on b3, bishop captures, and now the move that pretty much works wonders in any position, and that is pawn to b4. Here Levon has to trade, because if you play something like c4, then okay, you have a passed c pawn, but Carlsen's b4 pawn is just incredible. You're gonna play something like knight d7, knight c5, put the knight here, put pressure on b3, and your position will be incredible. So here, of course, Levon has to trade. C captures on b4, knight captures on b4, and now we have knight to d4. We have queen e5 now, hoping that Levon plays something weird, so Magnus can play rook captures on d4. He will happily give up the rook for 2 pieces, but Levon says nope, pawn to f4, kicks away the queen, queen to b8, and now, while you could play a lot of good moves here, Levon plays the absolute coolest one, the best one, and the trickiest one for Magnus to handle, and that is knight captures on e6. Beautifully done, giving up the knight for 2 pawns, and for the rook on c8 as it would seem. So f captures on e6, bishop captures with check. We're going to pick up the c8 rook as well. King to h8, bishop captures, and now rook captures on c8. And now if you count the pawns and the pieces, okay, Levon has the 2 rooks, but Magnus has a bishop and knight for a rook, and also Levon is up 2 pawns. So if you had to evaluate this, should be equal. So here, rook to a7 by Levon continues playing in great style. The bishop nicely defends the a7 pawn, and you are putting immense pressure along the 7th rank. And now bishop to c5, challenging the bishop and also the rook here. So bishop captures on c5, rook captures. Also, it was very important to play this move to prevent the queen from coming to b5. That would be very nasty with an attack on the bishop and the knight. So rook d to e1, rook d to a1, doubling up on the a file, and now knight to c6 by Magnus, kicking away the rook. But first we're going to play queen to e3, now threaten to pick up the rook on c5, and now rook to c2. We have rook 7 to a4, getting the rook out of harm's way, and now queen to d8, now activating the queen by attacking the knight on d2. So knight f3, and now knight to e7. Here Magnus is preparing knight to g6, and then the knight will probably be able to infiltrate, maybe via the h4 square. Maybe you can put more pressure on this f4 pawn with the knight on g6. So many things are possible. Also the e4 pawn is attacked, and if the white pawns start marching forward, they look scary, but they will of course become easier targets. So here we have queen to b3 now, attacking the rook and the bishop, but this allows Magnus this very clean queen to c7 way of handling things, defends the rook, defends the bishop, and now puts pressure on the f4 pawn, and also the e4 pawn is under attack. So how can Levon handle this? One good way of doing it is queen to e3. This kind of defends everything, but then you allow this knight to g6 move, and this puts pressure on the f4 pawn, and if f5, knight f4, and this is lost. White can just resign this. There's really no good way to handle all of the threats. Knight to e2 check is coming, rook to c1, also a possibility in some lines. The knight can come to h5, then to g3. This is just looking terrible. So instead, after queen to c7, we have knight to d4. Levon goes for a very tricky idea, attacks the rook on c1. Magnus goes rook to c1 check. We have a trade here, captures. We have king to h2, and now queen to captures on f4 with check. Magnus grabs one of the pawns. Queen to g3 offers a queen trade, and now queen captures on e4. So this is how Magnus eliminated both of the pawns, but can Levon do something now? Rook to b4, putting pressure on the bishop. Also, the queen can never move from defending the g2 pawn, because this would be checkmate. So bishop to d5, not allowing any rook captures on b7 ideas in the future, even though for the moment it's not a possibility. But bishop d5 here, the bishop is nicely protected by the knights, and now Magnus is just looking for ways, how do I get these two knights as close to the white king as possible? So here Levon could play something like knight to c6, open up a discovery to the white queen, pick up the knight here, and the game continues. It's not a nice position for Levon, but let's say you go for this knight c6, attacks the queen, for example queen e6, you trade here, and you move the rook. Yes, it's two pieces against a rook, but still, maybe you can save this. However, after queen to f2, there is no good way of saving this, but it's also important to play the absolute most precise move. So feel free to pause the video and try to find the only move that gives Magnus a winning position while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting this incredible maneuver with the knight. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is knight to g6. This is what Magnus played, and now there is very little Levon can do. Knight to h4 is coming, and there will be all of this pressure on the g2 pawn you simply will not be able to handle. For example, if you play a weird move, let's say rook a4, just knight a4, and that's it. There's no defense against knight captures on g2. All of the moves are just really, really bad for white. So instead, after knight g6, Levon says, all right, I've got nothing better. Knight to c2, puts pressure on the queen, queen to e7, and now rook to d4. Putting pressure on this bishop here, but now bishop to e4. So Magnus still just having a very, very dominant position, and the knights are getting closer and closer to the white king. We have knight to e1, and now queen to e5 with check. Luckily, the rook is protected, so you're not going to lose the rook. King g1, and now knight to f4. And now this knight will come closer as well. Rook to b4, and now king to h7. Magnus could also just start bringing the knight into the game, but let's keep it as clean as possible, not avoid any back rank checks in the future. So rook to b3, and now knight 6 to d5. We have knight to f3, attacks the queen, queen to c7, and now queen to b2. Hoping to get maybe some rook to b7 action going, as the queen also attacks g7, so maybe Levon can deliver some sneaky checkmate, but Magnus just moves the queen. Queen c5 check, we have king to h2, and now knight to e3. A very, very nasty move. Now just going after the g2 pawn. If the knight moves, then of course there's a triple attack, and there is no move Levon can play. Of course, Levon will try. He offers a queen trade, but now Magnus trades queens, but in the cleanest way possible. Knight f1 check, king to h1. If you go for king to g1, then knight to e2 check picks up the queen, so this is impossible. So king h1, and now Magnus trades, but by doing so also wins the g2 pawn. Knight captures, and now of course bishop captures on g2 with check. King to g1, and now of course bishop captures on h3. Really winning in a cool way, saying that okay, you can capture the bishop and then take the knight, but even if you do this captures, I'm still up 2 pawns, and Magnus would very happily demonstrate how to win this elementary endgame, being up 2 pawns with a knight against a knight. So Levon not about to give him this pleasure. He plays rook to f3, pawn to g5 now, and rook to a3. Now Levon is just at the mercy of how Magnus will win this actually. So king g6, we have knight to f3, and now knight to g3. We have king to h2. And now knight to f5, rook to a6 with check, and now king to h5. You don't have to worry about any sneaky checkmates, as there really is no way to pull this off. Knight to e5, constricting the movement of the black king, but it doesn't really matter. Pawn to g4, pawn to g3 coming. So rook to a3, and now it would be very, very ill-considerate to play g3. If you play g3 check here, white will be able to pick up the pawn, and then it's a draw. For example, knight captures, king captures, now attacks the knight and the bishop. So if you move the knight, you're going to lose the bishop. So king g5 defends the knight, but now we can harass the black king all we want. And at some point, for example, knight captures here, you're going to move to e5. Now we're going to deliver a check again. At some point, you're going to have to move away from the defense of the knight, and then we're just going to trade captures, and it is a draw by insufficient material. So it would be very, very good for Levon if this happens, but Magnus not about to allow such a thing, so he plays bishop to f1, and now again Levon has to figure out how to play this, but there is no good way. Probably Magnus wants to shift the bishop over to this diagonal to help out against attacking the white king, but here rook a4 now attacks the knight, but now just pawn to g3 with check. King g1, knight to d3, and now knight to d7. Going for knight to f6 check, maybe Magnus blunders something. Bishop to h3. Now you can see that Carlsen's bishop is controlling f1 and g2, and the pawn controls f2 and h2. So there is very little the white king can do. If you allow Magnus 2 moves, you can very easily get checkmated. For example, knight h4, knight f3 check, king h1, and knight to f2 will be checkmate. So if you allow that, it's game over. So knight f6 check by Levon, king to g6. This is a really cool check by Levon, because if Magnus plays king g5, which in a rapid game is possible, he can obtain a draw with knight e4 check. Now king f4, knight to c5 check opens up a discovery, picks up the knight here. For example, king f3, knight captures here, and now you are still down 2 pawns, but you have a rook and knight against a knight and bishop. So with perfect play, you will be able to draw this. But again, Magnus not about to allow this king to g6, not allowing any sneaky checks with the knight. So knight e4, we have knight to f4, and now rook to a6 with check. King to h5, now knight to f6 check, king to h4, and now rook to a4, going after the knight here, but now king g5, knight to e4 check, and now king to g4, and that's pretty much it. Knight to c3 was played, but here knight to h4, and it was in this position on move 69 that Levon Aronian resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. Once you make a move, and it doesn't matter what move it is, let's say even you go something like knight to e2, you want to win the knight here, just knight to f3 check, and once the king moves and h1 is your only square, the bishop covers the f1 square, pawn to g2 will be checkmated. There's no stopping this. Levon saw this, and of course here he resigned. So quite an equalish game, and you know, the position was just really wild, so it could have gone either way, but a very cool way of countering the London. So if you are struggling with the London, and okay, this is a very specific line, as usually white will play e3 instead of this funky h3 move, but if someone does play h3, you should know that you can immediately exploit this by gaining this beautiful expansion on the queen side with the immediate b5. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. First, the game that we are covering from round 3 of the FTX Crypto Cup. Really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I would like to thank Ricky Imeni, excellent subscriber, Brendan Ward, Johan Claesen, and Raymond Raphael for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the FTX Crypto Cup until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.